Without any further ramblings of Sean, we have a guest speaker today who's not really a guest because you all know him, and also you see that he's in the pastor chair today. So help me welcome Michael up to the stage.
Yay. Thanks, Sean. You know, I may just let you preach for second service, you know. This is good. Well, as you noticed, I'm not Pastor Scott. He is with Riley, and they are getting some preparations done for her transition to Mexico to go be a missionary down there. And so they're doing that, and he asked me to speak today. And so here I am. So have you ever met someone who turned out to be completely different than you thought they would be? You know, maybe it was your neighbor, maybe it was your teacher, maybe it was your kid's teacher. And, you know, you had kind of one thought about who they're going to be. And then as you got to know them, they turned out to be totally different, maybe even breaking the mold. You know, do you have that person? If not, I'll wait. But think about that person. Kind of think about that dynamic. How, you know, you expected one thing and you got something totally different. Well, that's happened to me several times in my life. And one particular instance that happened to me, I was in Washington, D.C. I was with a couple of friends, and we were walking around the Capitol. And, you know, we had the Capitol building right in front of us. It was about sundown. And there's this park in front of the Capitol, and we see, like, all of these, like, lights set up, like temporary lights, not like, you know, park lights. And there's a group of people down there, like, I think we need to go investigate what this is. And so we went over there, and as we got close, we realized that Anderson Cooper for CNN was interviewing John McCain, Senator John McCain, like right there, right in front of us. We're like, what? And if you see my Facebook, I reshared this picture that I got with Anderson Cooper. And so if you haven't seen it, you can go on my Facebook feed and see, you know, my picture with him. And we're like, well, that's amazing. So we sat there and just kind of watched the interview, and afterwards we went up and shook their hands, and, you know, got to shake hands with Senator McCain, which is pretty cool. Talked to him for just a minute. He had to go. But Anderson Cooper stayed there for a while and just talked to us, probably for like 30 minutes, which is not at all what I expected, because if you don't know who he is, he doesn't really live a godly lifestyle. He's a big shot on CNN. Like, he has his own show on there. He's an anchor or whatever on CNN. And so I expected one thing from him. I expected him to look at us, maybe give, you know, the obligatory wave and then leave, you know, because we're not good enough to be around him. Maybe, you know, we're mere peasants to his greatness. But that's not at all who he was. He was a really, really nice guy. It's almost like kindness, like, radiated out of him. And he just stood there, shaking our hands and talking to us as if he had no better place to be in the entire world. And, you know, more and more people, as they saw the lights, they came up. We had 50 or 100 people, and they're like fumbling over their cameras and dropping them and trying to get pictures with him. You know, I thought it was kind of annoying, and I wasn't even in the picture. But he just stood there, very nice, very humble, very reassuring, and I thought that was a cool thing. It was almost as if Anderson Cooper thought that we were the famous ones, as opposed to him. And one of the funny things then is I posted that picture like that night on Facebook. One of my friends said, hey, I'm watching him on TV right now, and he's wearing the same suit. Like, you did meet him today. I'm like, I did. He turned out completely different from my expectation. And I think sometimes we treat God like that. You know, we have this Christian heritage in our country. It may be your family who's grown up Christian, or maybe not. But one way or another, just because of who we are as a people, we sometimes have this expectation of God, this preconception of who he is. And I know I have that sometimes. And it's just like the people we thought about earlier. And just like the people we thought about earlier, God often tends to be very different from what we expect him to be. He often breaks out of the mold that we create for him. And what God keeps teaching me over and over again is that he's much bigger, much deeper, much stronger than I ever expect him to be. Who he is much bigger than I thought. In the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis talks about Aslan. Now, spoiler alert, you may not know this. Aslan is a representation of Jesus. Shocker, right? I say that jokingly. If you haven't read it, it's kind of obvious in the books. And there's a statement that C.S. Lewis makes that Aslan is not a tame lion. He does what he wants, he goes where he wants to go, and he operates on his own timeline. And he's a representation of Jesus. Jesus is the same way. You know, the Lion of Judah is not a tame lion. We can't confine him to our zoo. We can't confine him to the molds that we make for him. He does what he wants. And who he is much bigger and deeper and stronger than we often give him credit for. And just like Jesus is different than we sometimes conceptualize, I think his love is different. There's a story that when the Apostle John, who lived to be a very old age, the other apostles got martyred, but John just wouldn't die. The Romans tried their best and they just couldn't kill him. And there's a story that when he was an old man, the younger men would come up to him and ask him, "Tell us about Jesus. Tell us about Jesus." And John would always say, "He commanded us to love one another." And often the young men would be, "No, yeah, but you know, tell us about this and tell us about that." And John would always bring it back. He told us to love one another. And I think about, sometimes I put myself in people's shoes. And if I were there, I know who I would be. I would be one of those young men telling him, no, but no, what did he say about like free will and like how God is sovereign? How does that interact? What did Jesus say about how do we figure out the end times? Tell me about the miracles that, you know, like didn't make it into the Bible. I want to hear about those. And I can almost just see John looking at me, just shaking his head. It's like, Michael, you don't get it. You know, in my mind, it'd be love. What? No, I want to hear about these other things. But if you've read John's writings in the New Testament, you wouldn't be surprised by that. You know, in his gospel, he doesn't even call himself by name, not even once. He calls himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that's not a prideful thing. It's not like he loved me as opposed to you other 11 schmoes. You know, I'm his best friend. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that he completely identified himself on the basis of God's love. And it's easy for me, and maybe it's easy for you, to often think of God's love as like, what, you know, like the little Christmas tree things in the corner, like that's over there. Let's get to the good stuff. And what John will want us to know, that love is the good stuff. It's much deeper than we give it credit for. God's love is much stronger. It does a whole lot more than we give it credit for. It's not just something over on the side. Like Sean was saying, and as we sang, you know, his love pursues us. It comes after us. It changes us. It's not just a nice feeling. His love is not just God's warm fuzzies for us that gives us goosebumps. It's it's an active force that works. There's an old saying, you know, from like the 80s or 90s, you know, love is a verb. And it's true, love does stuff. But I have to keep reminding myself about that. And I had a reminder of that earlier this very month. You know, I work as a software developer at a company in Grapevine, and I had a pretty obnoxious middle manager, and I had it's an awful interaction with her, and she was mean and manipulative and just spreading stuff about me, and just, it's like, ugh, I don't want to face it. And the next morning, I just kind of happened to get up early, and I was spending time in prayer, and I was thinking, God, what do you think about this situation? Honestly, I didn't even really want to go to work. I just wanted to work from home or call in sick. It's like, I didn't want to face that crap again. And what God told me, I was hoping he'd say something like, I'll take care of it. Like, I'll take care of it, you know, in the mafia sense. Like, I'll take care of her. But that's not what God said. What God told me, he said, let my love be your confidence. Let my love be your confidence. And that's something I had to think about. That's something that I had to meditate on. You know, these things we kind of talked about. He wasn't telling me, you know, God wasn't saying, let my nice feelings about you, let that be your confidence. He was saying, let my active force that works on your behalf be your confidence. As you cast this care on me, let that be your confidence. One of my favorite passages in the Bible about God's love comes from a prayer that Paul prayed in Ephesians chapter 3. And kind of a side note, I think it's a really cool thing to study the prayers in the Bible. Often it's easy to read over them. But if we study the prayers in the Bible, I think we can learn to pray in a more mature way. And that's a different sermon, not going to get into that. But one of those prayers is in Ephesians chapter 3, verse 14. And we'll get it up on the screen. And hopefully, okay, I think you can read that, good. I typed it in, so I was hoping that it was readable, because if not, it'd be my fault. But in the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, verse 14 of Ephesians chapter 3, Paul writes, "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. I pray that he may grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power in your inner being through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted and firmly established in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and width, height and depth of God's love, and to know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever, amen." In this prayer, Paul prays for four things. He prays for four things to happen. He prays for the Ephesians to be powerfully strengthened in spirit. He prays for Christ to dwell in their hearts through faith. He prays for them to comprehend the magnitude of God's love and for them to truly know and experience God's love. And if you look at it closely, the first two things are things that he prays that God would do. And the second two things are primarily things that he thinks the Ephesians should do. And I don't want to discount the first two things. I don't want to ignore them. It's an amazing thing when God powerfully strengthens us spiritually. It's a very necessary thing for us to allow Christ to dwell in ourselves daily. But I want to focus on this idea of love. The last two things that he wanted the Ephesians primarily to do had to do with God's love. In verse 17, Paul writes, "I pray that you, being rooted and firmly established in love." When you think about rooted, I think the image that comes to mind is a tree. A tree that is rooted down, its roots go down into the soil. For a lot of trees, trees vary, but for a lot of trees, you'll often see that the roots are as deep as the tree is tall, sometimes taller, sometimes less. But they go down a lot farther than we'd think. If you've ever tried to pull up a stump, you know that. Sometimes people have wrecked trucks trying to pull up a stump. Often they resort to dynamite to get rid of all this stuff. And that's the image that Paul has for us. Not with our foundation going into the soil, but for our foundation, for us to be rooted in God's love. Because God's love is bigger and deeper and stronger and more powerful than at least I often give it credit for. He wants us to be firmly established in it. The idea is that we're almost getting nutrients spiritually from God's love. And that's what he wants for us. And he continues in verse 18, "that you may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the length and width, height and depth of God's love." Length and width, height and depth. It's a three-dimensional thing. It's not a pretty picture. It's not a point in time. It's this structure almost. And, as you may or may not know, I'm a big Greek nerd. I like reading the Bible. I like all that. And as I study this, there's something that's really obvious in the original that doesn't really translate. And that's the enormity of these words. These are not, it has length and width and depth to it. But what really is clear in the original is how it's not just that it has those, but that it has them and they're huge. It's massive. Don't think of like even a building at a church. Think of like a mountain. Think of like a skyscraper. God's love, he wants the Ephesians to comprehend not just, okay, love is three-dimensional. Okay, love does stuff. But that love is huge. It's this giant thing. And I think about, sometimes I put myself in Paul's shoes and I try to think, okay, what is he thinking about? And the language he uses sounds a lot like a structure in Jerusalem. Paul grew up in a city called Tarsus, which is in modern day Turkey. Kind of, if you know geography, kind of like where the Mediterranean kind of bends down and starts going south. It's sort of right on that corner there. But he spent much of his teenage years in Jerusalem. And there's this thing in Jerusalem, man-made, and it's still there today. Solomon built it when he built his temple in about 960 BC, so about 3,000 years ago, and this thing is still there today. Maybe you've heard about it. It's called the Temple Mount. Solomon built it out of concrete and out of stones, and he built the temple on the mountain, and he kind of had to flatten it and prepare the foundation. So there's this kind of the mountain, and on top of the mountain is like this cap. It's 37 acres, so it's big, made out of concrete and rock, and still there today. And it serves as the foundation, well, for the first temple, Solomon's temple, and then the second temple, and then when Herod's temple, and now the Dome of the Rock, which is there now, that the Muslims built there. And it's this strong foundation. It survived earthquakes. It survived 2 temples getting burned down to their foundation and all the stuff being melted and all the damage that's caused there. It survived all the construction projects. And I think the way he's describing God's love here sounds a lot like the Temple Mount, which you would have seen. In the same way that the Temple Mount, this massive structure, was a foundation for the temple of God, God's love can be a foundation for the temple of the Holy Spirit, which is us. It'll survive the storms of life. When things come, when it seems like there's an earthquake going along and everything's being shaken in your life, well, the Temple Mount withstood all that. God's love will withstand anything that comes. If we build our lives on other things, it could be shaken away. But God's love, again, it's not this small thing. It is a massive construct. And just like the temple was firmly established on the Temple Mount, we could be firmly established in God's love. And I just want to say that maybe you feel like you're in a place where just things seem out of control. And that probably means that you have some work to do. But maybe the primary thing is not to focus on the work. It's to focus on getting yourself refoundationed, if I can make that a verb, in God's love. You can worry about the work later, but getting your life reoriented based on God's love is a powerful thing. And Paul continues in his prayer. He says, he prays that the Ephesians would know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Filled with all the fullness of God. It's an easy phrase to just kind of let slip by. But take a second and think about it. The fullness of God. Full. Everything that God is. We won't know everything about him. Our brains probably couldn't comprehend it. But if we want to come to a full knowledge of who God is, that comes when we really get to understand this love. There's a difference between knowing someone and knowing about someone. I know Pastor Scott, I know him personally. I know about Governor Abbott. I've never met the governor of Texas. And he seems like a nice guy. I like that he's constantly fighting for smaller government, which I happen to appreciate. I don't want to bring politics into this, but I know about him. I don't know him. And that's kind of the differentiation Paul wants to make here. He wants us to not just know about the love. He wants to really know it, to experience it. And when we experience the love of God, that's when we begin to enter the fullness of God. We don't know God through only knowing about the Bible. We don't know God from seeing miracles. We really begin to know the fullness of who he is. It comes through his love. Now, of course, obviously, if you know me, I'm a big believer. Bible quiz, right? Let's memorize those verses. Looking at you too. No, the Bible quizzers in here for me to look at, but we got to know the word. But what's primary is we've got to know the love of God. We can't let it just be head knowledge. We can't, let miracles just be this thing. Even Jesus said When people came to him, hey, we did all these great things in your name. We drove out demons. We healed the sick and all these things. And, it's possible that there will be people at the judgment. He'll say, yeah, but I never knew you. When we want to know God, when we want to know who he is in fullness, it comes through his love. And Paul finishes his prayer. It's in worship. Now to him who is able to do above and beyond all that we ask or think according to the power that works in us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever, amen. And there's a lot of amazing stuff in there. When sometimes I read things in Greek and I get kind of shocked, like the language that Paul uses. Not that it's bad language, but that it's just how giant it is. And it's not just far and above what we can ask or think. It's so much farther than we can ever imagine. As far as the atmosphere is above the earth. It's how as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my thoughts higher than your thoughts. Isaiah said. And God can do so much more than we can even imagine. So much more than we can even think. And it comes from his love. So let's go back, though, to the words that God spoke to me a few weeks ago. He said, let my love be your confidence. I think it makes a lot more sense with this kind of a view of love. Thinking that this giant foundational thing that which we build our lives. And when we fully begin to really understand that is when we enter the fullness of who God is. So what does that mean for us practically? Well, practically, it means that all of you are invited. It wasn't just a word for me, I think. It's a word for all of us, that we can have confidence in the love of God. We can have confidence in who he is and what he says about us, and we don't need to worry about what other people say. I don't need to worry about that mean and manipulative and gossipy middle manager in my work, because I can have confidence in what he says, and you can too. Firmly established in his love. Jesus said in John chapter 16, he said, in this world you will face troubles. It's a guarantee. And it's not just a guarantee from life, like a proverb. It's actually, the word of Jesus. Thanks. He guaranteed that we will face trouble. But it's not where it ends. He says, take heart. I've overcome the world. We can be anchored in that. Anchored in who he is. And second, I think what's really profound, what God's been teaching me and reteaching me, is we can get our worth from him. And so we can work and do our stuff and live our lives from a place of worth and not have to work for worth. Have you ever thought about, maybe times in your life or people that you've seen and they're constantly trying to prove themselves? And they often come across as insecure or not having things all together. And there's a very big difference in our lives when we don't have to prove anything, when we can just be free and be us. We can work and live from a place of worth and not have to always feel like we have to earn our worth, earn our value. See, people are naturally inclined to look for worth and value somewhere. Often it'll come from relationships, like who they're dating. My sister told me the story yesterday about her roommate and just doing weird and crazy manipulative things to try to, get her ex-boyfriend back. And having these things on my mind, all I can think about, she's trying to get her worth from that relationship. But you know what? That boyfriend was having none of it. They're done. Which meant that her friend, her worth is coming from that relationship, which was over. And so just plummets. Done. And, well, maybe we don't do that, but it's often common that sometimes we'll look for worth from a job. I have a great job. I make a lot of money. But if the economy turns, if we get laid off, if we get fired, or maybe you get a new boss and you clash with him, if your worth comes from your job and those things happen, your value plummets. Your sense of value internally plummets. Maybe you get your worth from your kids, and you think, haha, I have the best kids in the world. They're so awesome. They're straight A students. They go to church and all these things. But you know what? There's this thing that happens around 13, when they become teenagers, and they start to rebel. And Dad, don't poke anyone. But when your kids rebel, if you're getting your worth from how good you are as a parent, when that rebellion comes, your sense of value will plummet. Why is that? Because our value is never supposed to come from people. It's never supposed to come from things. Our value is supposed to come from God, from who he says we are, for what he says that we can do. That's where our value, that's where our worth is supposed to come from. And we need to parent and work and have relationships coming from a place of worth and not trying to gain worth from those things. That's how we have confidence in his love. In Genesis chapter 1, this is kind of a side note, but I think it illustrates the idea. Genesis chapter 1, God created the heavens and the earth in 7 days. And each day ends the same. God did his work, and it'll say, it was evening and it was morning the first day, the second day, the third day. I said that kind of fast, so think about that. And maybe you've noticed this, maybe you've never noticed this, and your mind's about to be blown. I don't know. Think about what it says. Pick your translation. Genesis says, it was evening, then it was morning, the first day. We would normally say it was morning, then it was evening, right? Because evening never comes before morning in our minds. For us, the day begins at like midnight 01, and it goes till midnight the next day. But Genesis is based on a Jewish understanding of a day. For ancient Israel and for observing communities today, the day begins at sundown. Like we think of like sundown as like kind of the close of the day, but really we have like another 7 or 8 hours till the day is really over. But to them, the day begins at say around 6 o'clock. And what's the first thing you do in the day? It's pretty awesome, especially if you know me. You get to eat. You get to eat a meal. Start the day and eat a meal. And then, even more awesome, you get to take a 12, that's too much, take an 8-hour nap. You eat, then you sleep, you wake up and you stretch, and then you do your work. And why am I saying all this? Well, in that mentality, you're working from a place of rest. Where often we'll rest from work. We'll have a long, exhausting day, like, oh, finally, and get done. And just that mental shift shows, and this is a totally different sermon to go deeply into, but that mental shift of working from a place of rest and not from a place of weariness. It's the same kind of idea of living and working from a place of worth. We don't have that exhaustion and that stress coming. We work and we live and we do our lives based on God's worth, what he says about us. We don't need to compete with people. We don't need to strive with other people. We don't need to try to gain their favor. We don't need to try to be manipulative. We don't need to try to win them over. Because you know what? If people treat us badly, all right, that's fine. I don't get my worth from you. If people reject us, okay. If people talk badly about us, well, that stinks. And maybe we need to maintain our emotions and manage, what we think. But ultimately, our worth doesn't come from that. And when God showed me that, it changed my life. And as God keeps re-showing me that, because it's not the kind of thing that you learn once and you're good for life. It's the kind of thing that I need to keep changing my mind, renewing my mind over and over and over again in the love of God, getting my worth from him, getting my confidence from him. When I get chewed out at work for things that aren't even my fault, or even if they are my fault, I'm not working to please them. I work to please God. You need to do your best at work. I'm not saying you slough off. You never do that because you're trying to work to please God. God says, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Serving the Lord, not men. But it's a different mentality. It's a strengthening mentality. So as Sean comes up, we're getting done a little early. And what I want us to do is just think about where you are in relation to God's love. Are you trying to earn favor and value and worth? Are you trying to get that from people or from work or from your kids? And I'm not saying that you need to come and confess it or let everyone know. This is going to be a time between you and God. And what I challenge you to do, encourage you to do, look deep inside of yourself. Think about the last week or the last month. Where are you getting your worth from? Where are you getting your value from? What is your identity? Where are you getting confidence from? Is it from God? Because that's going to endure and last even through the storms of life. If it's not from God, it'll last for a little while. It will. And that's great. But it will go away. Why? Because we will face trouble in this life. So as Sean plays, I encourage you to look deep. And maybe, you'll find things, you'll kind of ascertain your life quickly. Or maybe, you'll be done quickly. And you feel free to worship if you want. But let's just take some time and reorient our lives to gain worth from God, to see his love, and let his love be our confidence. Go ahead, Sean.